Charlie and Luna, welcome to the podcast. I want to get your take first and foremost on consumer confidence. What are you seeing? Honestly, couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, guys. Chris, welcome back. Time flies. It's episode 2.
Yes.
Are you excited?
Yes, and I'm particularly excited for us to introduce who we actually are.
Yeah, because we didn't do that, which is quite poor form as marketers. So I'm actually going to break the fourth wall here, and I'm going to look directly into the camera's eyes. We interrupt this moment for a message from our sponsors. We are GWI, a global consumer research company. We interview almost 1 million people every year and then house all of that data in a nifty but powerful platform, which you can access on demand. Also, my name's Jenna, if you didn't know that.
Yes.
I'm a content marketing lead here at GWI, and I'm joined by Chris, our senior data journalist? I was going to say data analyst.
Data journalist, yeah.
Okay. You can pick your title. No one's going to sense check.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's data journalist on my contract, so we'll go with that. But yeah, I'm a data journalist here at GWI, and yeah, I suppose I'm responsible for being at the coalface of consumer trends, trying to find out what's new, which audiences are being underserved, and generally trying to surface all the best nuggets of wisdom and insight from our platform that we've now introduced.
You've rehearsed that, and now mine looks really boring. I write some content. And I interview Chris. That's my role here. Anyway, we've got a lot to talk about today. And this session is a bit of a fact-checking session. So we're going to do a data versus discussion type format. Couple of things to kick off with. We're talking about consumer confidence and also people quitting.
Yes.
Which is something I've seen loads about. So I guess let's start with consumer confidence then. Before we dive into it, explain it to me like I'm 5. Because I know there's different ways to measure consumer confidence. So what do we mean when we talk about consumer confidence?
Yeah, it's a fair point, and some researchers do measure it differently. But how we define consumer confidence is essentially how many people, when they do one of our surveys, say that they think their personal finances will get better in the next 6 months. The idea being, well, if you see an increase in that number, then that's an increase in the number of people who will be spending more money.
Right.
And therefore, that's useful information for brands who might want to access that spending. And it sometimes uses an economic indicator as well, because a lot of our economy depends on consumption. Mm-hmm. And that's how we define it. And there's some quite interesting stories going on here. So the global story is really interesting because we hit quite a nifty milestone with this. So we started asking about consumer confidence in that way in 2019. So we've been measuring it for 5 years. And earlier this year, we saw consumer confidence at the highest level globally since 2019. Mm-hmm. In other words, it was the first time that we'd seen it match its pre-COVID levels. As you might imagine, it went down significantly. Early stages of the pandemic was starting to come back to normal. Then we get the invasion of Ukraine, big inflation, big increase in heating bills for a lot of people, and it's slowly been climbing up out of that. So now globally, we're roughly back where we were. Mm-hmm. And I'll pivot a bit to the UK because we've got our own interesting story here. It's been very volatile since COVID. We had quite high confidence immediately coming out of lockdown. People like, finally, I can get out, go spend money on these things that have been closed all this time.
And also spending all the money that we had saved up by not doing anything.
Exactly. But then we go through the same process of inflation's kicking in, it's getting quite bad. And it's over the last year, 18 months, that inflation has started to settle down. And certainly what we see in the data is people are getting more optimistic about their finances. Mm-hmm. Now, I think latest inflation figures came out just this morning, didn't they? Or the morning we're recording.
Today, basically, the inflation has risen for the first time since last year.
Yeah. But compared to where we were, it's by quite a small amount. And the important thing is that wages are now outgrowing inflation. So I think the best way we can summarize what we're seeing in our data, bearing in mind that consumer confidence UK is higher than it's been for a long time, and globally it's higher than it's been for quite a long time, is cautious optimism. Mm-hmm. And, what we're seeing is more hint suggestions in our research, but there might be a bit of light at the end of the cost of living crisis tunnel.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's an interesting comment that is on a BBC article about this, which I do want to quote, because I think this actually gets at some of the difficulties in interpreting this data or trying to sort of process it at a human level. So this commenter says, I know little about economics, but it's funny how we always notice very quickly when it gets worse, i.e. everything becomes more expensive, but we never notice when it gets better, i.e. nothing actually gets cheaper. And I find it very interesting because I'm not sure if it's negativity bias, loss aversion, whatever it is, but I think it's easier for us to process the idea like, things getting worse for having less money. I think we as humans just feel.
Yeah, we feel that. I have a game in my group chat where after we do a like food shop or something, or even like a dinner shop, so something small, we send a picture of what we've bought and then everyone has to guess how much we spent. And it's like, I've noticed personally that the answers are less surprising recently. Whereas like 6 months ago, everyone was like, what? That was £30? Whereas now it's like, oh, that was 15? Not too bad.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe because I'm biased, I've actually been tracking this myself in my group chat. But I am starting to feel things be a little bit easier.
Yeah.
A little bit easier.
But it's almost sort of hard to say. It's less part of the discourse, isn't it? It's sort of harder to admit that, okay, things might be getting better. I think it's not, I think generally most research says it's not quite symmetrical. Like if we're going into bad times inflation, like that feels worse for us than the idea like, oh, things might be getting relatively a bit more comfortable. So as well as that kind of headline metric we have about consumer confidence, we have some quite interesting tidbits across our research. And there's one of our data sets in particular which is really good for this. And I think you can explain a bit more about the background to this.
Yeah, exactly. So for those GWIs that subscribe to GWI Core, there is a free add-on data set, which is basically an extra bit of data that you get on top of GWI Core. And it basically gives you really localized insights across a few markets. So like I think Spain, India, Germany, the UK, France, Canada. And it lets you zoom in on really niche topics. So like smoking habits, broadband suppliers, consumers' diet, like really niche things. And specifically lets you zoom in on quite a localized view because of the markets that we re-interview people in, basically.
Yeah, so it has, lots more brands, and it can go into a bit more detail about the purchase journey in different areas, like the ones you mentioned, or, household products.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is obviously a big one in the context of inflation. And it's useful to give us context about how and when we launched this, because we launched that data set in 2021, I want to say, summer, autumn. So when we started fieldwork for it. So in a sense, I almost think of it as the cost of living crisis data set, because effectively it's been running all throughout that time. And what we've seen is this general pattern where across these different categories of food, hair care, medicine, all these different categories, like price becomes a more important factor because people's spending power is reduced. And it's so interesting because you see it in two levels. You see it within each category, but if you take that bird's eye view and start, really slicing and dicing the data and putting it all across, you see it kind of repeating. You think, yeah, this is quite a consistent thing. And so what we're starting to see now is for that price concern to level off or even decrease in some areas. So that's what we mean when we say we're getting these sort of signals across our research of maybe there's a cautious optimism, consumers not being quite as price conscious, and therefore other things coming onto the agenda. And there's one example of this I think is quite useful because it speaks to the broader trend where we have a question about if you're switching your energy supplier, like what's important to you? Because obviously that's something where prices have changed the most in the past 2-3 years for reasons that are well known. And you see this pattern where price has become, price is always important, obviously, but it's got even more important, whereas the eco-friendliness of your supplier doesn't matter as much. Yeah. So you could put it crudely as like people have generally thought, oh my God, I just need to spend the less money each month on energy. Don't care where this is coming from. Don't care if it's solar, nuclear, whatever. Like just desperately need to save some money. Whereas now people are like, actually, maybe I can think about, emissions and that kind of thing.
It's almost like sustainability becomes a bit of a luxury, right? Like if you can afford to be sustainable with your energy provider, then you probably will be. But that comes second best to the cost of it, or even third best or fourth best or wherever it sits. Yeah,
no, it's a very good point. And it's worth mentioning that's a really consistent finding, not just across our research, but a lot of other research in general. We can probably share the link in the show notes. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but there's a paper from the US that shows like in recessions going back to the late 80s, this always happens. So as recessions kick in, people generally care less about the environment. And I agree, whether you consider it luxury indulgence or just changing priorities, whatever it is, like the pattern is very, very recurrent. Yeah. And I will say the other thing that we're starting to see, because it begs the question if price becoming less important, it's like, well, what's becoming more important?
I was going to ask, like, what? So we're now seeing prices becoming less important. Yeah. What's taking its place?
So there's a couple of things that stand out if you do that kind of bird's eye thing of look across categories of like which patterns am I starting to see recur, and they're interesting. They do overlap quite a bit. So one is just essentially, product performance, actually how good it is. So it's the idea of like, if you're going to if you're going to buy something, you can now afford a slightly better version of it.
Yeah, you don't want it to break.
Exactly. It does make sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're going to upgrade, like you're going to buy a slightly better frying pan or
Okay.
whatever it is. The other one is quite interesting. It's around expert recommendations, which I guess is very similar to performance. But let's say you're at the dentist or the hairdresser or something, and they say, there's actually this, toothbrush I'd really recommend because it's really good or whatever, but a bit pricey, it's 80, 100 quid, let's say. Whereas 2 years ago, you'd be like, no way.
Yeah.
Now what we're seeing is people actually I'd be a bit more receptive to that.
More.
Or, hairdresser says like, I've noticed this about your hair. I can recommend this product. It's really good for it. Again, maybe a bit pricey. Now people would be more comfortable with it.
Yeah.
And, I think these insights are important because, we all know price importance. We know it ourselves. It's well established in research, but of course not every brand can or wants to compete on it.
Yeah.
So it's good to know about these other things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The dentist example is quite funny because it's almost like the brand play there would be if you actually get the experts on your side to do some mini advertising on a one-to-one basis, like whilst they're in the dentist chair, like that probably goes way further than, or currently way further than something else, right?
Yeah.
I'm such a sucker for buying things that experts tell me, like when I'm at the hairdresser and they're like, oh, you should also buy this product. I'm like, fantastic, add it to the list.
Yeah.
So if that's already happening more, I definitely need to put myself on a budget. Okay, so on to our next trend of people quitting. So basically this all started, right, because I saw an article published by The Times about women in their 40s quitting their jobs. And it was all kind of around like the false promise of capitalism. Like you've been hustling for ages and now you're being, missed off for promotions, pay rises kind of stunted, lack of career progression. And so women in particular, this was the focus, are bowing out. So the tagline, I'm going to read it because if I paraphrase it, I won't do it justice. Older millennial women are leaving the workplace, fed up with being overlooked for promotion and realizing that having it all means doing it all, which I thought was very interesting. So I was wondering if this was just a single article in isolation, because often you get a journalist who gets a tip and it's an interesting story, but it's not reflective of the wider trend in a market or a country or even a generation across the globe. So I turned to my other favorite sources of news, TikTok and Reddit. And I basically started looking into this and I was seeing loads of stuff around lazy girl jobs, which is a really interesting kind of hole to go down. So it's basically like stuff women can do. Again, I say women because that's what I'm seeing. To basically clock in and clock out and like not work outside the hours that you're prescribed. Stuff that's really easy to do, doesn't necessarily take much brain power. And then I found a tweet that really nicely sums it up. So again, I'm going to read this out. I'm in my 30s. Of course, I'm burnt out because I grew up being told hard work pays off. So I made working hard my entire personality. But it turns out it actually doesn't pay off. It just creates more work and sets unrealistic achievement standards that's impossible to keep up with. So really, I just wanted to fact check this trend and like understand whether it's happening in a bubble. Because I remember around the COVID time, there was so much around like quiet quitting.
Yeah.
And that certainly felt like a global trend. I don't know what our data said about that at the time, but this feels like it's snowballing slightly. And the audience in question is women, specifically older millennial women, but also the Reddit and TikTok stuff is younger women. The other interesting thing that I was seeing on Reddit was the fact that so many people were replying like, guys, no one's ever wanted to work. Like, it's not, this isn't a new thing that we want to break from working. Like, we're all just waiting to retire, which I thought was quite funny. So what does our data say? Can we fact check this? Like, who's quitting their jobs, if anyone?
Yeah, so there's a few interesting parts of it. And yeah, it does seem that there's certainly in the culture, there has been these concepts that have been discussed for a while. I think quiet quitting was the first one I remember. And yeah, there's probably, the context around working from home. It's probably just easier to comment on your work when you're at home versus an office environment. And yeah, it's always interesting to consider data in relation to the discourse. Because, often they're complementary. Often it's someone coming out and saying something that, for me as a data analyst makes me go and look at something. Actually, they're on something that we aren't really looking at. Other times, like you say, it's maybe a smaller sample of people who might be particularly vocal and it's not kind of representing the wider picture. So there's a few different things we can mention in relation to that. I think, firstly, you could interpret this two ways, I suppose, because I remember we looked in this data when quiet quitting first came out. And if you look at the demographics who are generally more likely to describe themselves as ambitious or career-oriented or all these things, like they are largely younger women.
Okay, interesting.
And then That does sort of decrease with age, but that decreases with age for everyone. I think that's just a very natural thing because
people get tired.
Well, you've already proven yourself in the workplace to a point, I
Yeah.
guess, right? Whereas in younger, you're kind of thinking, okay, how do I forge my own path?
Yeah, develop a name for myself.
And yeah, so we did look into an audience of, I think, 35, 44-year-old women is
Yeah.
what we identify as the sweet spot
Yeah.
for this kind of trend. And they don't really seem to be much more likely than the average to be thinking about quitting. But it was a useful exercise to see, who does think about quitting? Like, what does that actually mean? So we did a data pull from our platform and sort of identified some audiences that are more likely to do it. I'm sort of going to put these at you because I'm interested to see what you make of these. So if we look at what jobs people have where you might think about quitting, these are generally speaking sort of entry-level hospitality service jobs. There's things like bartending, waiting staff, baristas, maybe cashiers, that kind of thing. And in fact, of all the job roles, bartenders are the most likely to be planning to quit.
Interesting.
So based on our data,
probably because Brits are sobering up.
well, yeah, although this is global as well, as we discussed the other week, so yeah, maybe something to do with that. 1 in 5 of them plan to quit their job in the next 6 months.
Wow.
Any one time.
And is that? I mean, we might not have the data on it right now, but is that more noticeably increased than before? Because one thing that I was thinking about was, okay, people working a 9 to 5, I wonder if the tenure for a single job is probably longer than those working in hospitality jobs.
Yeah.
There might be something in that we kind of don't have visibility over. But I did wonder because there's I know this is kind of people get a bad rep in the corporate world for like jumping between jobs, and arguably I don't always think that's a problem at all because that's kind of how you climb the ladder in most cases. But I do wonder if it's maybe more common in hospitality jobs. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I suppose you can interpret quit in different ways, both as an analyst and a respondent in that sense.
Yeah.
And certainly, do you know the job role where people are least likely to be thinking of quitting their jobs?
Ooh.
It's quite appropriate, you might say.
Okay. Oh, God. What do people do for a really long time? I don't know. I want to say something like librarian. I imagine them to be the same.
I mean, I can't remember what the figure for our librarians was. We do have that as a data point, but it's risk consultants.
Oh, that's very risk averse. Of course it is.
They've run the numbers. They've thought, actually, I'm safer just collecting this
Fair
this
enough.
monthly wage from here until
that's so beautifully ironic.
But I think, to your point, we can identify other audiences where, quitting is more in the picture. So an interesting one is people with side hustles. So, that points to the idea of, well, if you're kind of building up this more entrepreneurial sideline, you've got something to quit into.
Yeah.
Right. So you're not leaving into nothing, which is obviously part of the picture.
Interesting.
And then the demographics quite interesting as well. So parents of newborn children are quite a bit more likely to quit.
That's really surprising because, I mean, personally, that would be the time when I would kind of feel like I need the most financial security, right?
True. So I suppose they must be thinking, well, I'm going to quit into something that pays more.
Right.
Maybe they've been in a job where they enjoy the social elements of it or other things, or like, well, now I've got other priorities. Like I need to change up. That's what we have to infer based on the data. And funnily enough, although it's not really 35, 44-year-old women, it seems like 25, 34-year-old men who tend to be doing it more.
Fascinating.
Which again, I don't know if that necessarily goes along with being parents of newborn children, but they are the one that tend to come out as more likely than others.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Maybe my algorithm is just feeding me women-only content.
Yeah. Well,
and I haven't seen the male side of things.
I suppose one other thing worth underlining, we do tend to see in our research, and you tend to see in other research as well, is like most people actually quite like their jobs.
Yeah.
They quite like working. That's quite a consistent finding.
Interesting.
And I suppose it's a bit like what we were saying earlier in the sense that people aren't as vocal if they think their financial prospects are getting better. You're not going to be vocal if you're kind of quietly think your job is okay and like make a good salary. You'll be vocal when you're planning to quit.
Yeah.
If you think things are getting to a head.
Yeah.
If you've got the platform, being on newspaper, that's more likely.
Yeah.
I will also highlight though, because I did go and look at the 35, 44-year-old female audience, and even if it's not necessarily coming through in job quitting, I think there's things worth paying attention to, if you're a brand or even just someone who knows 35, 44-year-old women. So, it's the time of their life compared to other women in the UK, especially. It's most likely time they're going to be working senior management and have kids that are aged between 6 to 18. So, it's quite a lot going on. I'd say, there's a few life stresses that may be going on.
Just a few.
Yeah, there's an element to say like, okay, maybe sort of what how to put this, the discourse around job quitting, like it serves a purpose in sort of drawing attention to like, come on, we're a group with feeling these stresses, and maybe it's kind of a release valve in that sense. The other thing, and so speaking of release valve, something else that I find quite interesting is there's no easy way to put this, but it seems to be quite into fighting.
Women?
35, 44-year-old women, yeah.
Like fighting themselves?
Well.
Or like watching MMA?
So compared to other women in the UK, 35, 44-year-olds more likely to play Tekken.
What's Tekken?
It's that kind of a arena fighting game.
Oh my God.
It's like 1v1, other sides of the screen.
Got it, yeah, like KO.
Exactly. Street Fighter, another game in that genre.
Yeah.
Beat 'em up games, and martial arts films.
Wow.
So the logical part of my brain
They're
thinks...
working through some anger.
So this is the thing, right? The logical part of my brain thinks maybe it's just like an age thing. Those things were popular when they're younger.
Like a nostalgic thing almost.
Maybe. Because you do see it, like older consumers much more into Westerns because they were on TV a lot more when they were younger.
I bought my first Nintendo Switch a year ago. Like, that's me getting involved in the nostalgia. I really wanted to play Nintendogs and they didn't have it.
But then there's an element of like, yeah, maybe that is just the ultimate stress relief. So, I think that's probably one word.
Mario Kart, the ultimate stress relief.
Underline it as more research needed.
Yeah,
but,
okay.
some initial insights
that's
for
really
everyone to stew
interesting.
on for now.
That's really interesting. I wonder if it ties in with the growth of, I don't know, like the growth of women's sports and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Could it be connected? Maybe. More research to be done. So we're going to jump into our local lowdown. I've purposefully not looked at this because I'm hoping that this is like really interesting and surprising. So I'm going to have to ask you to take it away. So local lowdown, for those who aren't aware, is where we dive into a specific market and look at trends happening within that market. So where are we traveling to today?
Trends and distinctive behaviors.
Yeah.
We track 53 countries, and it's a fascinating exercise to look at how they're all different from each other. I think, we just had the Olympics, and I think we just sort of naturally enjoy that kind of country comparison. It's like, oh, we do this, you do this.
Yeah.
The Chinese gymnasts didn't know how to bite a medal, the Italians did. Like these kind of most cultural understanding. But yeah, last episode we covered Hungary.
Yes.
And this time we're moving a few hundred kilometers north to Poland.
Mm-hmm.
And this is partly a tribute and shout out to my next door neighbor who's from Poland.
Okay.
So Carolina, if you're watching, listening, thank you for sense checking the insights, and thank you for the banana bread that you very, very often give to us.
Carolina, please like and subscribe. Thank you.
Please like and subscribe to your friends. So Poland, very interesting countries in many other ways. I actually want to start with a stat that's not from our research, but by Welcome, the global charitable foundation. So they did a survey in 2020, which looked, among other things, levels of trust in government across country, and they found that there's the same proportion of people in Poland who trusted their government as there were in Iraq, which I find personally quite amazing because Poland is, of course, part of the EU. It's had democratic government for a number of decades, really strong economic growth in the last decade. Iraq does not have those things, and yet trusting government is quite the same. So that probably says a lot about the consumer sentiment in Poland, the general kind of attitude there. And what we see that manifest in our data in a couple of ways. There's two attitudinal data points that are quite similar and probably speak to that distrust of government. So one of them is worrying about the government tracking them online. Mm-hmm. They're at the top of the list or very close to it for that, and preferring to be anonymous online. So you can see how they're both very, very complementary. And we do generally see that pattern in countries across Central Eastern Europe that were formerly communist or very close to formerly communist states, and does make quite a bit of sense. One-party systems, they had huge state surveillance apparatus. It makes sense that would kind of filter down in this cultural way. Mm-hmm. Now, that is interesting in its own right. For me, the really, really interesting thing is one of the other ways Poland is distinctive is for buying a particular product. So now I want to put this question to you, Jenna.
Okay.
In a country where trust in government is very low, what do you think is a consumer product that people are going to buy more? Purchase what do purchases?
Oh, so like a Ring camera or something, or like security systems, or a VPN.
VPNs, I suppose so, but not quite the right lines. I mean, I like your thinking, but I'll give you a hint, or like
something. I'm trying to think of something. A disguise, a fake mustache to help them remain.
There is a clue somewhere on this table actually that we're sat on.
A plant, laptops.
No.
Hand sanitizer.
So it's actually bottled water. Oh. Yeah. So this is a very, very interesting thing. So there's different things you could say about this. I'm actually going to quote what my next neighbor Carolina sent to me about this, because Yeah, Poland, more than any other market, they're more likely to buy bottled water. And this is quite an established thing. And paraphrasing what Carolina said to me, it's generally because, especially in the communist era, like there were very, very poor quality standards for tap water. You had to boil tap water essentially to not fall ill. Like
interesting.
It was that bad. When bottled water started becoming widely available because of, plastic production, that kind of thing, that's what people would buy. Poland entered the EU in 2004 and had to comply with water standards, which has proved them a lot.
Yeah.
But people are still quite skeptical about tap water, more likely to buy bottled water. And she even mentioned when she first moved to the UK 11 years ago, which is pretty recent, she was quite shocked that people drank tap water. And she reckons that she's not sure whether any restaurants in Poland would serve you tap water, even if you asked for it. By default, it's bottled water. So if we were recording this in Poland, I probably wouldn't be drinking tap water out of this mug.
Yeah.
Not because of the quality, but the general perception in the country. Yeah,
that's really interesting.
And
I wonder if it is drinkable now. Like, it must be drinkable now.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But there's that level of trust that people still steer towards.
It's a long-established thing.
Yeah.
I tracked down a Washington Post article written in 1991, which is about tap water in Poland, and you use it to talk about other things. But to give a quick quote to give you an idea of what the quality was like then, it's described as yellowish brown from the tap, laced with heavy metals, coal mine salts, and organic carcinogens. It stains the sink, tastes soapy, and smells like a wet sock that's been fished out of a heavily chlorinated swimming pool.
Wow.
So just to confirm...
So not delicious at all.
No. That is in 1991. That is not now.
Yeah.
Poland's part of the EU. Water standards are, in line with European regulations. But it gives you an idea of what is within living memory for a lot of people.
That's fascinating.
Also... Another interesting fact about Poland and water, but you didn't realize there were so many.
I had no idea.
So you know The Office, the sitcom?
Yeah.
The Polish version of that is not set at a paper company. It's set at a company that makes bottled water.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So I wonder if that's a kind of unconscious, recognition of how large the market for it is. It's just so established as a consumer product that, if you're going to set The Office anywhere, it's going to be in something as ubiquitous as bottled water.
Fantastic. That's really cool. I think that's all we have time for, isn't it?
I don't
have anything else on the list. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like what you saw, you can obviously like and subscribe. This was all based on our newsletter On The Dot, which you can subscribe to. And every Wednesday, you'll get a lovely email packed with insights just like these directly to your inbox. Thank you.
Thank you.